These Violent Delights, Chapter 22. Morning turned to noon with an exhausted Flop, beams of gray daylight streaming through the dirty windows of the burlesque club. Juliet waved at the cigarette smoke that wafted below her nose, grimacing and holding back her cough. "Is the radiator broken?" Juliet yelled, her voice carrying loudly. "Turn the heat up and get me more gin." She was already wearing a long coat lined with fur thicker than her father's account books, but each time the door slammed open, a cold breeze swirled in and further chilled the brisk day. "You finished the whole bottle already?" one of the waitresses remarked. She had a cloth in her hand, scrubbing at the nearby table, her nose scrunched in the direction of the glass in front of Juliet. Juliet picked up the empty bottle, examined the delicate detailing, then set it down upon a flyer. She had found the thin piece of paper on the streets before she came in. The corner was rumpled, and now from how much she had been fiddling with it. "Get vaccinated," the flyer read in large lettering. At the very bottom, there were 2 printed lines offering an address in the international settlement. "Tone down the judgment before I fire you," Juliet replied, the threat delivered without much conviction. She clicked her tongue at a passing kitchen hand. "Come on, another bottle." The kitchen hand hurried to accommodate. The crowd in the burlesque club during the day was sparse, and for the gangsters who came during these hours, there was nothing to do except dawdle around and watch Rosalind's watered-down daytime routine. At night, all the stops were pulled out, and Rosalind kicked and cha-cha'd her way into the extravagance. The lights would glow to their fullest capacity, and the hum from the floor would be enough to power the chandeliers, which twinkled gold against the hazy red ceiling. But while the sun was up outside and the bodies scattered amid the round tables were few, it was as if the place were hibernating. Rosalind usually worked 2 hours during the day, and she clearly hated them, if her inability to pay attention was any indication. From the stage, she had raised an eyebrow at Juliet, wordlessly asking why Juliet was throwing a fit from the audience, and in the process missed the first few notes of her next song. "Drinking at 1 in the afternoon," Rosalind remarked, when she came up to Juliet an hour later, already finished with her set. Having changed out of her flashy stage dress, she slumped into the chair opposite Juliet in her dark green kipau, blending into the deep green of the seat. Only her black eyes stood out in the bland lighting. Everything else became strange and gray. "Well, I'm trying." Juliet poured deftly, then offered the half-full cup to Rosalind. Rosalind took a sip. She grimaced so severely that her usual pointed chin morphed into 3. "This is awful," she coughed, wiping at her mouth. She looked around them, eyeing the empty tables. "Are you meeting someone here again?" "A merchant," Rosalind was suggesting, or perhaps a foreign diplomat, a businessman, people in power who Juliet was supposed to be rubbing shoulders with. But since Dexter Walter, who had been more of a pest than anything, her father hadn't given her anyone else to meet with. She had one task only: find out why the people of Shanghai were dying. "Every time I knock on my father's door to ask if there are any more important people he would like me to sweet-talk, he waves me off like—" Juliet performed an exaggerated imitation of her father's hurried expression, flicking her wrist quickly through the air like a limp fish. Rosalind bit back a laugh. "You don't have anywhere to be, then?" "I'm merely spending time in your talent," Juliet replied. "I'm so bored of these ordinary people who don't know the difference between a drop kick and a flat kick." Rosalind pulled a face. "I don't even know what the difference is. I'm almost certain you have just made those terms up." Juliet shrugged, then threw the rest of her drink down. The answer she had given was the truth. She only needed to be seen at the burlesque club for long enough that it would not be suspicious when dusk came and she slipped out to meet Roma. Juliet shuddered. Slipping out to meet Roma. It was too reminiscent. A wound so long removed yet still fresh and open and sore. "Are you okay?" Rosalind jolted. "Why shouldn't I be?" The cosmetic application was good, but Juliet spent a long time every morning fiddling around with her pots and jars, too. Without looking very closely at all, she could tell where Rosalind had heaped on the creams and powders, could track the exact line where her real skin ended and her false layer began to cover up the shadows and dark circles. "I worry that you're not getting enough sleep," Juliet replied. A loud crash came from their left. The waitress, who had been cleaning the table, had knocked over a candle holder. Rosalind shook her head. It could have been emotion both in disapproval over the waitress or in response to Juliet. I've been sleeping, just not well. I keep having dreams about those insects." She shuddered, then leaned forward. "Juliet, I feel hopeless, merely sitting around while the city falls apart. There must be something I can do." "Relax," Juliet said gently. "It is not your job to take on." Rosalind placed both her hands flat on the table, her jaw tightening. "I wish to help." "Help me by getting some sleep." Juliet tried for a smile. "Help us by dancing with all your beautiful brilliance, just so we can forget, even for a few minutes, that people are looting stores and setting fires in the streets." Just as they could forget that madness was striking every little corner of the city, this was not a force police officers or gangsters or colonist papers could fight back against. Rosalind did not respond for a long moment. Then, to Juliet's shock, she asked, "Is that all I'm good for?" Juliet jerked back. "Pardon?" "One would think that I don't even need to be a Scarlet anymore," Rosalind said bitterly. Her voice was almost unrecognizable, forged by a shard of broken glass. "All I am is a dancer." "Rosalind!" Juliet leaned forward too, then her eyes narrowing. Where was this coming from? "You are a dancer, yes, but one in the Scarlet Inner Circle, privy to meetings and correspondence even our own father cannot stick his nose into. How can you doubt whether or not you are a Scarlet?" But Rosalind's eyes were haunted. The bitterness had given away to anguish, and the anguish ate away at her temper until she was only gazing forward in defeat. That monster sighting, it had affected her more than she had let on. It had set her on long nights and spirals, and now she was questioning everything that her life was stacked atop of, which was dangerous for someone like Rosalind, whose mind was already in eternal, spectral place. "It is only that it feels unfair sometimes," Rosalind said quietly. "That you were allowed to be in this family, and you shall have your place in the Scarlet Gang, but I am a dancer, or I am nothing." Juliet blinked. There was nothing she could say to that. Nothing except, "I'm sorry." Juliet reached out, placed a hand on her cousin's. "Do you want me to talk to my father?" Juliet shook her head quickly. She laughed, the sound brittle. "Please, never mind me," Rosalind said. "I'm just... I don't know. I don't know what's wrong with me. I need more sleep." She stood then, squeezing Juliet's hand once before letting go. "I have to go home now and rest if I want to be ready for my shift tonight. Are you coming?" She wasn't, but she also didn't want to let Rosalind go while it seemed like there was still a conflict here. A conflict between them that had been left unresolved. It was unnerving. The hairs on the back of Juliet's neck were standing up as if she and her cousin had just had a fight. But she could not pinpoint where the friction lay. Perhaps it was her imagination. Rosalind's eyes had cleared now, injecting more spirit into her spine. Perhaps it had only been a brief moment of eternal calamity. "You go on," Juliet finally replied. "I have some more time to waste." Nodding, Rosalind smiled once more. She walked out the door, and another cold draft blew in, this one shaking Juliet so viciously that she curled her entire neck into her coat, becoming a girl swallowed in fur. Now there was not even a show to keep her entertained. She had no choice but to people-watch her Scarlets. "How long have you been wiping at that table for?" Juliet called. The waitress looked over, sighing. "Xiao Shai, the stains are persistent." Juliet shot to her feet and clacked over to her heels. She extended her hand to the cleaning cloth. The waitress blinked. "Miss Kai, it is not proper for you to get to your hands dirty. Pass it." She passed it. Juliet scrunched it up in her fist. In 3 quick, violent motions, her hand coming down on the table so hard that it made a sound. The surface was smooth and clear and shiny. Juliet gave the cloth back. "Use your elbows. It's not that hard." "I had a thought." Juliet looked up from his sketchpad, squinting at his attempt to focus in Marshall's face. It was an overcast day, yet there was still a blinding brightness glaring through the thick clouds and streaming into their living room. The result was a terribly depressing sky without the comfort of proper heavy rain. "My ears are on top of my head." Marshall flopped down on the long couch too, carelessly shoving Benedict's legs aside. He pretended not to hear Benedict's sound of protest, not moving even when he almost sat right on his friend's bare foot. Do you think it is a little peculiar that Lord Montagov has been sending us on so many scarlet missions lately? How is he getting this information? It is not peculiar. Benedict's focus returned to the movement of pencil against rough paper. We have spies in the Scarlet Gang. We have always had spies in the Scarlet Gang. They certainly have spies among our ranks, too. We have spies, certainly, but not to this extent, Marshall replied. He always looked so somber when he was trying to concentrate. Benedict found it a little funny, if he was honest. It didn't suit Marshall. It was like a jester wearing a three-piece. What? You think we should have managed to infiltrate their inner circle? Benedict shook his head. We would know if that were the case. Can you stop wriggling around so much? Marshall did not stop wriggling. It seemed like he was trying to adjust his seat to get comfortable. But the couch cushions were going to detach and fly right off if he kept at it. Finally, he settled in and propped his chin in his fist. The information was just been so accurate lately, Marshall said, a hint of awe entering his voice. He had the time of the masquerade before Roma did. This morning he sent me after Kathleen Lang and had her exact location. How is your uncle doing this? Benedict looked up from his drawing, then looked down again, his pencil moving in a quick arc. A line of jaw emerged with the curve of a throat. A smudge in the shading became a dimple. Lord Montagov sent you after Kathleen Lang? He asked. Marshall leaned back. Well, he's not going to send you or Roma into a communist meeting. You speak the language, but your face does not blend in as mine does. Benedict rolled his eyes. Yes, I understand that. But why are we following Kathleen Lang now? Marshall shrugged. I don't know. I suppose we want the information she acquires. He squinted at the weather outside the window. A beat of silence passed, nothing but the rapid sound of shading from Benedict's nub of pencil. Should we resume our pursuit for a live victim today? Marshall asked. Benedict supposed they should. They were running out of time. Elisa was counting on them, and if they had more avenues to exhaust in order to find a cure, wasn't it on them to at least try? Sighing, Benedict tossed his sketchbook onto the table. I suppose we must. You may always resume drawing after we fail and call it a night, Marshall promised. He craned his neck and peeked at the sketchbook. But my nose is not that big. At sunset, Juliet slipped out of the burlesque club with her head down, her chin tucked into her collar. It was both an effort to avoid being seen and to brace against the frigid breeze, a gale that stung her skin with every point of contact. She didn't know what it was about today that brought the early winter in with such a bite. Buns, hot buns for 2 cents. Get them now, get them hot. Miss, we're selling fish for cheap. Fortune-telling, palm reading, Xiaozhe, you look like you need... Juliet swerved left and right through the open market, staring at her shoes. She pulled the hood of her coat up until most of her hair was buried in the fur, most of her face swallowed by the fuzz. It wasn't that it was dangerous to be recognized. She had 10,000 excuses up her sleeve as to where she was going, but she wasn't in the mood to spin lies. This country was her old friend. She didn't need to look up to find her way around. This way and that way and this way and that. Soon she was moving along Avenue Edward VII, finally lifting her head and bracing her cheeks against the cold to search for Roma. The activity along this street all headed in one direction, toward Great World. It wasn't quite fair to call this place an arcade, like Juliet was fond of doing. Rather, it was an indoor entertainment complex with everything under the earth. Distorted mirrors and tightrope walkers and ice cream parlors came together in a cacophony of activity that worked to suck away a day of your life and all the money in your wallet. The central attraction was the Chinese opera, but Juliet had never liked it much. Her favorite was the magicians, though she hadn't been inside the arcade for years, and by now all the magicians she had been familiar with had probably moved on or had been replaced. Sighing, Juliet scanned the 5 blockbuster Chinese characters sitting directly atop Great World. They burned against the glow of the fading sun, backlit with the barest hint of fiery orange. White, golden, dragon, cigarettes, she translated, the task more confusing than it had used to be. She had forgotten for the shortest second to read right to left instead of left to right, which she had gotten used to in the last few years. Focus, Juliet muttered to herself. Juliet's wandering attention dropped to follow the stream of faces coming in and out of the doors to Great World. She searched carefully, scanning the masses in the rapidly falling night as they followed a loud advertisement into every vice readily available, until her gaze came to the front of a dress shop. Leaning upon a signpost, Roma stood with his hands buried deep in his pockets, shadows under his eyes. Juliet strolled over, her shoes silent against the gravel for once. She prepared to chide him for standing so far from the building and making it hard to find him. Only when she came near, something about his expression caught her off before she had even started. "What's wrong?" "Don't look back," Roma began. "But you were followed." "I was not." Her denial came fast and unwavering, though it was more an act of rebellion on her part than true certainty. As she spoke, her first instinct was to shrivel around and prove Roma wrong, but logic instructed her to refrain. She held herself still. All the tendons on her neck pulled taut. She had indeed been deep in thought while making her way over, concentrating on keeping her face hidden from those in her view rather than watching for the lurkers in her peripheral. Could she have picked up a tail? "A white man stopped right when you did," Roma said. He pulled a newspaper from his pocket and started reading it on the middle of the street. "I don't know what your thoughts were, but it is highly suspicious to me." Juliet started rummaging through her pocket, cursing under her breath. "He might not be a threat," she insisted. "Perhaps he is one of yours, doing surveillance on your activities." "He is not Russian," Roma countered immediately. "His clothing and hairstyle say British, and we have none of those within our ranks." Juliet finally found out what she was looking for and pulled out her facial powder. She opened the box and angled the mirror folded within, scanning the darkening streets behind her without turning around. "Found him," Juliet reported. "Yellow handkerchief in the front pocket?" "That's the one," Roma replied. She didn't know how Roma had distinguished the tail as British. He looked like any other foreigner on the street. Juliet peered closer at her mirror. She changed the angle slightly. "Roma," she said, her voice rising. "He's got a gun." "Every foreigner in this city has a gun. He's pointing it at us," Juliet cut in. "He just drew it from behind the newspaper." Tense silence fell between the two as they desperately thought through their options. Around them, Shanghai continued moving, alive and vibrant and unbothered. But Roma and Juliet couldn't merge back into this crowd without being followed by whatever they were going next. There was no cover to hide behind and disappear from. Nowhere to draw their own weapons before the Brit could see and shoot first. "Untie your coat and embrace me," Roma said. Juliet choked on her sudden laugh. She waited for the pin to drop, but Roma was being serious. "You're kidding," she said. "No, I'm not," Roma countered evenly. "Do it, so I can shoot him." Their British tail was more than 100 paces away. There were dozens of civilians walking back and forth in the space between. How did Roma expect to shoot him in all these conditions while embracing Juliet? Juliet gave the ribbon around her waist a tug, loosening her coat and lifting her arm in the same movement. In her other hand, she snapped her mirror closed, cutting off all her sights on the tail. "I hope you know what you're doing," she whispered. Her lungs were tight. Her pulse was a raging war drum. She wrapped her arms around Roma's neck. Juliet heard his breath catch, a quick inhale, hardly perceptible. But had she not been so near? Perhaps he had not considered the fact that asking for Juliet to act his cover would mean coming close to her. He certainly had expected her chin to automatically find its place in the crook where his shoulder met his neck, just as it always used to. They had both grown tall and grown thorns, yet Juliet had slotted back so easily. Far too easily for her own liking. "Lean closer," Roma instructed. She felt his arm moving, retrieving his pistol behind the cover of her coat as it billowed on either side of them in the breeze. Juliet remembered when Roma swore to her that he would never pick up a gun. He had never grown comfortable with automatic weaponry like she had. In those few months they had spent in Shanghai at 15, Roma hadn't been living the same life as she had. While he operated in his comfortable claim as the heir of the White Flowers, Juliet was fighting to be seen, hanging on to her father's every word, in fear that missing a single instruction would place her into obscurity. "We do not have the luxury of mercy, Juliet. Look at this city. Look at the starvation that squirms under the layer of glamour." Her father's favorite teaching tactic had been to take her to the attic of the house, so they could peer through the highest window together and squint at the city center at the horizon. Empires can fall in mere hours. This one is no different. Here in Shanghai, whoever shoots first has the best chance of surviving. Juliet had learned her lesson. seemed that Roma had picked up the same sentiment in the years she had been gone. "Don't miss," Juliet whispered. "I never do." A bang sounded from the space between them. Juliet immediately whirled around to catch the British tail collapsing before he stood, a bright red spot blooming at his chest. There was a smoking hole in Juliet's coat, but she barely noticed. Her mind was on the streams resounding around her as they sought the source of the sound, on the flurry of movement that had stared upon the cobblestones. Gunshot sounds were common in Shanghai, but never in a place so occupied, never in a place that the foreigners used to brag about to their friends back home. Gunshot sounds belonged to gangsters and conflicts across territory lines, in the hours when the devil prowled the streets and there were moonlight beaming down in the sky. Now was supposed to be the reserved for the warmth of the sunset. Now was supposed to be a time of pretending Shanghai wasn't split in two. Yet in the chaos there was 3 other places of absolute stillness. Juliet hadn't been followed by 1 man. She had been followed by 4. So they needed to run now. "The arcade," Juliet commanded. She turned to Roma, frowning over his slowness. "Come on, this is the first time I've actually had to run from a crime I've committed." Juliet blinked. His eyes were pulled wide, disbelieving. He hadn't seemed to be entirely present as they dove into the crowd, pushing against the abundance of hands and elbows that were splurging in all directions in an attempt to find safety. "A crime you committed?" Roma echoed softly. Juliet had to strain to hear him. "I shot the gun!" Juliet scoffed, turning. "Do you really need credit for—" Her sentence died against her lips. She had thought Roma was correcting her, claiming ownership over the crime, but then she saw the expression on his face. It had been accusation. He hadn't wanted to shoot. Juliet turned away quickly, shaking her head as though she had seen something she wasn't supposed to. Here she was, thinking that he had finally adapted to the gun, and in the very next second he was surprising her with his play acting. How much of his exterior was a mere image? Juliet hadn't considered before this moment that while Roma was being swept into the rumors on her cruelty, thinking her transformed into something else, perhaps Juliet had been falling into the exact same trap, buying into the bales of ice and coldness that had originated from within the white flowers themselves. Juliet frowned, ducking to splurge through a small gap between 2 open parasols. When she emerged on the other side, her eyes wandered over to Roma again, to his clenched jaw and his calculating stare. She never seemed to know what was real and what was not when it came to Roma Montagov. She thought she knew him, and when she did not. She thought she had adjusted after he betrayed her, marked her off as wicked and bloodthirsty, but it seemed he still was not. Maybe there was no truth. Maybe nothing was as easy as one truth. "Quickly," Juliet said to him, shaking her head to clear her mind. They managed to enter Great World, pushing at the entranceway to check for their pursuers. Juliet glanced over her shoulder and found 2 of the 3 men she had spotted before, each pushing their way through the crowd, their eyes glued on her. They moved strategically, always behind a civilian, always ducked low to the ground. Roma was tugging at her shoulder to keep her moving, but she was searching for the 3rd man, her hand going to her ankle. "Where is he?" she asked. Roma searched the crowd, and after a fraction of a second pointed to the very side, where the man was running, perhaps looking for an alternative entrance into Great World so that he could corner them inside. Juliet pulled her pistol from her sock. The man was seconds from disappearing from view. Even if Roma was not the brutal heir the city thought him to be, that did not mean Juliet's reputation was any less true. The running man crumpled as Juliet's bullet embedded into his neck. Before her pistol had stopped smoking, Juliet had already pivoted on her heel and was shoving deeper into the building. Inside Great World, most of the attendees hadn't heard the gunshots, or had simply thought them part of the arcade's sound and atmosphere. Juliet wove through the crowd, her reflection darting in every corner of her eye as she tried to navigate past the exhibit of distorted mirrors. "How are we going to lose the other 2?" Roma called. "Follow me," Juliet said. They pushed through the thickest part of the crowd and burst outdoors into the hollow center of Great World. An opera show was in full swing here, but Juliet was busy searching for another inner entrance back to the building of Great World, frantically eyeing the external staircases that zigzagged from floor to floor. Juliet surged forward again and plowed through a family of 5, then ran into a woman carrying a bird cage, wincing when the cage clattered to the floor and the bird gave a squawk of death. "Juliet!" Roma shouted from behind. "Watch it!" "Hurry up!" Juliet snapped in response. His carefulness was slowing him down. Juliet caught a flash of one pursuer coming through the mirror exhibit. The other collided with an exasperated love-letter scribe making for the exit. "Where are we going?" Roma huffed. Juliet pointed to the wide, white stairs that loomed into view. "Up," she said. "Quick, quick. No, Roma, duck!" The moment they pulled up into the stairs, elevating atop the crowd, the pursuers had cleared shots of them. Bullets ricocheted through the open space, urging Juliet to take the steps 3 at a time. "Juliet, I don't like this!" Roma shouted. His footfalls were heavier than hers, taking 4 at a time to stay on her speed. "This isn't my idea of fun either!" Juliet shouted in response, stumbling up the 2nd floor, landing and bursting back inside the central circular building. "Keep up!" This floor was occupied by people, not attractions, pimps and actors and barbers all offering their services to those who were searching. "This way," Juliet said, panting. She dashed past the startling row of earwax extractors and barged through 2 swinging doors. Roma followed suit. In here! In here!" Juliet grabbed Roma's sleeve, yanking him furiously into the racks of the lace-hemmed robes. Are we hiding?" Roma whispered. "Only temporarily," Juliet replied. "Squat." They squatted into the clothes, holding their breath. A second later, the doors burst open, and both remaining pursuers entered, heaving loudly into the quiet of the dressing rooms. "Check the side," one demanded of the other, British accent. "I'll check over here. They could not have gone far." Juliet watched the 2 men part, following their progress with their feet, waiting until the 2 pairs of shoes were a good distance separated. "That one's yours," Juliet whispered, pointing to the set of shoes coming closer and closer. "Kill him." Roma grabbed her wrist, the motion whip quick. "No," he hissed quietly. "It's 2 against 2. They can be spared without harm." A metallic clang rang through the room. One of the men had tipped over a clothing rack. Juliet pulled her wrist away harshly, then nodded just so they weren't wasting more time arguing. She scuttled forward while the man she had assigned to Roma had stopped near him, likely scanning his surroundings. The other kept pacing, and to keep up with him, Juliet had no choice but to spring up from her squat and move fast, breaking into a run through the racks with her back hunched. She didn't know what gave it away. Perhaps her shoe had squeaked, or perhaps her hand had brushed up against a hanger that clanged against metal. But suddenly the man stopped and whirled around, his gun firing into the racks, his bullet skimming past Juliet's ear. Another shot fired quickly. Juliet didn't know if this had been the other man or Roma. She didn't know what was happening, except she was darting out from the racks and aiming at the man, needing to pinpoint her shot within the millisecond before he took aim again. Her barrel smoked. Her bullet embedded into the man's right shoulder, and his weapon dropped to the floor. "Roma," Juliet called, her eyes and aim still pinned to the Brit. "Did you get him?" "Knocked him out cold," Roma replied. He strolled closer, coming to a stop right behind Juliet while she pointed the gun forward. "Who sent you?" she asked her last pursuer. "I don't know," the Brit said quickly. His eyes swiveled from the door to the gun's barrel and then back to the door again. He was 20 paces away from the exit. "What do you mean you don't know?" Roma demanded. "Other merchants spread the word that there was money from the Larkspur for whoever killed Juliet Kai or Roma Montagov," the man stammered. "We tried to our hand at it. Please, come on. Just let me go. I seemed too good to pass up, you know. We thought we could have enough trouble finding you separately, but then you showed up together. It was like we actually would have succeeded." The man trailed off. By the widening of his eyes, it seemed that he was realizing that what he held in his inventory. He knew. He knew that Roma Montagov and Juliet Kai were working together. He had seen their embrace. That gotten him information to take to the Larkspur. That gave him power. The man lunged for the door. Juliet yelled out in warning. It was incomprehensible whether he was directing a shout at the Brit or at Juliet, and darted after the Brit furiously, one hand outstretched in a bid to grasp his collar and haul him back to the room like a stray dog. By then Juliet had already pulled the trigger. The man dropped to the floor, slipping out of Roma's grasp with a heavy finality. Roma stared down at the dead man. For the briefest moment, Juliet caught shock marred into his wide eyes, before he blinked once and shuddered it away. "You didn't have to kill him." Juliet stepped forward. There was a splotch of blood on Roma's pale cheek, running an arch so that his cheekbone was stark in the dim bulb light. "He would have killed us." "You know," Roma dragged his eyes up from the body. That he got pulled into this. He didn't choose it like we did. Once upon a time, Roma and Juliet had come up with a list of rules that, if followed, would have made the city something tolerable. It would have made Shanghai kind, only salvageable, because that was the best they could. Gangsters should only kill other gangsters. The only fair targets were those who chose the life they led, which Juliet later realized included the common workers, the maids, the chauffeurs, nurse. Fight dirty, but fight bravely. Do not fight those who cannot understand what it means to fight. Nurse had known exactly what working for the Scarlet Gang entailed. This man had pulled a hint of glitter into the ground, accepting a nugget of gold and disturbing a hornet's nest instead. They would leave him here, in a puddle of his own blood, and soon someone would come in and find him. The poor worker to make the discovery would call the police, and the municipal forces would arrive with a weary sigh, looking upon the man with no more emotion than someone observing a dead wheat field, displeased with the general loss upon the world, but overall void of any personal attachment. By all their old rules, this man chasing after them should have been spared. But Juliet had lost those old rules the second she lost the old Roma. When conflict erupted, she thought about herself, her own safety, not that of the man waving a gun in her face. But an agreement was still an agreement. Fine, Juliet said shortly. Fine? Roma echoed. Without quite looking at him, Juliet pulled a silk handkerchief from her coat and passed it forward. Fine, she said again, as if he hadn't heard her the first time. You said to spare him, and though I agreed, I still went against it. That is my wrongdoing. While we keep working together, we listen to each other. Roma brought the handkerchief to his face slowly. He dabbed an inch away from where the splatter actually was, wiping at nothing except the brutal line of his jaw. Juliet thought he would be content with her poor attempt at an apology, would at least nod in satisfaction. Instead, his eyes only grew more distant. We used to be pretty good at that. A pit formed in Juliet's stomach. What? Working together, listening. He had stopped wiping at his face. His hand merely hovered in the air, its task undetermined. We used to be a team, Juliet. Juliet strode forward and yanked the silk from Roma's hands. She was almost insulted that he was too aggressively bad at wiping up a simple blood splatter. In one furious swipe, she had stained the white of her silk with a deep red, and his face was beautiful once more. None of it, she hissed, was real. There was something awful about the shrinking distance between them, like the coiling of a spring, winding tighter and tighter. Any sudden movements were bound to end in disaster. Of course, Roma said. His tone was dull. His eyes were electric, like he, too, was only remembering just now. Forgive me for that particular oversight. A tense moment passed in stillness, the slow release of the spring back in its usual position. Juliet looked away first, moved her foot so it wouldn't touch the puddle of blood growing upon the rotting wood floors. This was a city shrouded in blood. It was foolish to try changing it. It would appear that while we search for the Larkspur looms close to us, she remarked, gesturing to the dead man. It seems like you're on to something, Roma said surely. We're closer to saving Elisa. Juliet nodded. Somehow it seemed that the Larkspur knew they were coming, but if he thought a few merchants were enough to scare them off, he would be sorely disappointed. We must arrive at his location before the night grows late. She produced the flyer heralding the vaccination, folding it so that the address at the bottom was on display. Absently, she used her other hand to wipe at a damp feeling in her neck, wondering if she had, in fact, also required blood splatter on herself without noticing. Roma nodded. Let's go.